the back can kindly occupy the seat in the front. We are starting the session in the next couple of minutes. People at the back, if you don't mind, please come and occupy the seats in the front so that delegates moving in from one hall to another would join in late and they will not cause any disturbance for the panelists as the session is in progress. So please come forward and take your seats. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are all set for the session 2 to begin. Digital public infrastructure of India going global is the theme of this particular session. Citizen Stack, the strategies for building DPI for the world. At the outset, I would like to call upon the moderator for the session, Mr. Sharad Sharma, founder of iSpirit Foundation. So let's give a round of applause and welcome Mr. Sharad Sharma. The esteemed speaker panel consists of Mr. Sanjay Jain, Director, Digital Public Infrastructure, BMGF, Shri Rajiv Bansal, CEO of NISG, Sudha Srinivasan, Madam, CEO, the Nudge Center for Social Innovation, and also we have with us Mr. Naganand Doreswamy, Managing Partner of Idea Spring. Just as the first session was very absorbing, I'm pretty sure in this IT Deep Tech Trends session, the digital public infrastructure of India going global also will go a long way towards educating all of us. Straight away, I would hand over the session to the moderator, Mr. Sharad Sharma. It's all yours, sir. Take away.
Thank you so much. So we have a wonderful panel. We're going to make it fun for you. But for us to do that, first you have to tell us, how many of you know about India Stack? Show of hands. All right. So I would say about 20–30%. All right. And so that's very helpful. We're going to get started. We'll start with what is India Stack and DPI. May I request Sanjay, dive in with you. You know, in some sense, that whole journey starts with a slide called the Rajni slide. Now, we don't have the slide with us. But people, if they like, they can go to iSpirit Rajni. They'll see a blue slide come up, but that's the one that we are talking about. Sanjay, tell us why that slide in 2012 was one of those pivotal slides. You know, there was a lot of discussion taking place leading up to that slide. And then that slide crystallized a thinking which has then guided much of the work on India Stack and DPI since then. Why is that slide important? What is that slide about? Paint the picture for all of us.
So when we are thinking about all the work that we had done and were doing around building what is now called DPI, the key question that we are trying to answer was, how do we make all this happen? What is the orchestration that we need to do? And so the thinking was, first is it put the user at the center. It said, here's this persona of a person, we call her Rajni, and this is what she wants to do, which is to lead her life in a meaningful way, be empowered to get a loan and improve her business, and so on. And so if that's what she needs, then what are the elements that will make her empowered to do all that, and how the state will play a role in making that happen. And the state's role cannot be to actually go give that loan or take care of everything around her, because that's not the way we can scale up to the entire country, but to enable private sector players, get the right incentive systems to make that happen. And so that then allowed us to think through what are those elements that are required, what are the private sector players you need, what are the rails we need to build to make that happen. And some of those were ready, some of those were not. And what it then allowed us to do was to say, okay, if we take this as our mantra, this is the problem we want to solve, and we know that if we build these rails, many other use cases will also get solved. Then we build that infrastructure over a period of time to enable that to happen. We worked with policymakers to keep that, again, end user in mind and make that happen. So that single slide tells a very powerful story of change that can happen if we do things right.
So in a way, at that time, we had this idea that there is an innovation deficit. We invented this India 2 and India 3, right? We said all the startups that Naganand was funding or his colleagues were funding were all for India 1. What is this India 1, India 2, India 3? And why were we focused on India 2 and India 3?
The way we think of India, it's 1.4 billion people, but if you think of it from a little more socioeconomic category, there is a part of India which is sort of the size of France, the economy of France, and the same living standards. So it's a set of people who are, have similar per capita income, similar lifestyle, and so on. And then there is India 2, so this is around 75 to whatever, 100 million odd people. Then there is the next set, which is India 2, which is like Indonesia, size of Indonesia, same income as Indonesia, same lifestyle as Indonesia. And then there is the rest, which is the vast majority of our people, which actually compares to sub-Saharan Africa. We have this massive diversity in our country, and in terms of, in many ways, these are people with different ambitions, different lifestyles, different choices, and we know that the private sector will cater to France. We know that they might cater to Indonesia, but they will rarely cater to sub-Saharan Africa. And that, told us that if we kind of focus our attention to there, that's the place where we can make change happen. And that is where the state intervention needs to be the strongest. And the state is not going to be able to do it by itself. It actually needs the support of this, I would say, this leverage point, which will allow private sector to come in and then do the heavy lifting. So I think from that perspective, that was our thinking, was that if you sort of focus there, we can make systemic change happen, which will then, transform the country.
So in some ways, is it fair to say that India Stack thinking at that time was really about addressing this innovation deficit for the Indonesia in India and the sub-Saharan Africa in India? And if so, right, Sudha, your journey is very, very interesting. You've been a technologist with Intel, but something tugged at you. And you said, look, let me work with the NGOs that are there in India and get them to serve this sub-Saharan Africa and Indonesia better than they could be able to do on their own by using this whole digital public infrastructure India Stack approach. And you spent considerable years. How many years? 7 years, and you continue to do that. So it's a big change, right? Go from a comfortable MNC paying you well, to kind of pivot into all of this. And so from your perspective, do you have buyer's remorse for doing that?
No.
And if not, why? Why do you think, has that shift worked for you?
If anything, it was the perfect storm. Right. So more than help non-profits or NGOs in the country adopt technology, the work was largely in bringing to life a new breed of startups that were impact-focused. Right? Non-profit in their legal structure, but not pursuing the unicorn dream, instead seeing how can they best create new technology that will serve India 3 in the same generation as technology is serving India 1 and 2. Not wait for trickle down, but create new technology. And I say it's a perfect storm because this is circa 2017 when the DPIs were starting to mature. And in the 120, 30 plus startups that I've had the good fortune to work with, More than half of them would not have been possible if the India stack had not existed. Right? Just to give you an example, when COVID hit, India One benefited from everything from contact tracing to having your vaccinations on a paperless record, just being able to manage your information, etc., because you had a smartphone. India too also probably got serviced because there was, even without a smartphone, with a regular phone, you could still use OTPs and connect to your information, get authenticated, etc. For India 3, that did not probably even have 100% Aadhaar enrollment at that time, we had startups creating community-based devices and technology. And one of them is Khushi Baby, who in Rajasthan converted their 10 rupee price point form factor of an IoT device, which was a form factor of a taweez that kids wear, into a contact tracing mechanism. Right? And that has now evolved into what is called CHIP, a community health integrated platform, which does everything for someone that needs a shared wearable, same as the Fitbit that you and I use. Right? So this is a community health worker going door to door, authenticating each person by their biometrics, and making available to them the services of health monitoring, be it a BP test or a sugar test or whatever else. And that is innovation that was possible because the India stack existed. So I think perfect storm in hindsight.
And that movement is only getting started. Is that fair to say? Do you think we are still, fully to leverage how to reimagine health, education, even cash flow lending, financial services, and many other basic services that our citizens need?
Absolutely.
We are still in the early stages of that.
Correct.
I don't think we can declare victory yet. Is that a fair thing to say?
Absolutely. And you say this often, Sharad, that while the markets innovate for the creamy layers, for everyone that is dependent on government services, whether it's public health, public education, and doesn't have markets coming for them yet, the size of the market is actually the biggest, much bigger than India 1 and 2 put together. So even the economic opportunity here is immense. You would not look into this space if there were no DPIs, but because there are, everything starting from data exchanges for, say, early detection of disease, data exchanges on crop and pest information. So there's a wonderful image database of pest attacks being put together, which makes it possible for you to have a completely different game in farm inputs, touching the smallest farmer who otherwise is paying the most per unit of farm input. Right? Everything can be revolutionized, and there's really no end to this. Our imagination is the only limit.
I want to come to you, Nagarand. Nagarand, I like you, and we are friends, but I think you are a different type of a VC than everybody else, right? Because you've been willing to engage in what would be perhaps in the near term marginal kind of opportunities, in the hope that they will become mainstream for India later. So therefore, you are not just in the harvesting business, but you are in the seeding business, as I see it, from my vantage point. And that's an unusual thing. And my question to you a little later is going to be, how do we make that the de facto mode of operating for all VCs in India? But before you answer that question on behalf of other VCs, we have two significant UPI players that emerged from Bangalore. We are in Bengaluru Tech Summit. One is JustPay and the other is PhonePe. Both happen to be based out of Koramangala. And at least, I think, Sanjay, we can claim that we had some role to play in helping both of them get into this business. But I have a trick question for you, and I'm going to ask Sanjay for whether your answer is correct or not.
This is what I was dreading, that I'm going to be quizzed
So
on this
Sanjay,
stage.
you have to give him marks whether he's giving the correct answer or not. Okay. So the question is, which is a more important company for UPI? Is it JustPay or is it PhonePe, and why?
So,
Second part of the question is, if you were to be an investor only in one of them, which one would you have chosen if you had that option to pick?
I mean, I think it's more bias that's going to speak now because I am more intimately familiar with PhonePe. So my intuition always goes to PhonePe, although they started with a different thing, but they evolved. But I like what they did because they pivoted very quickly. And for me, founders' ability to look at what opportunities exist and then pivot very quickly and use the infrastructure that is becoming available becomes very important. And they've done a phenomenal job. And then today, they own the UPI market, right? You know, if you look at across all vendors, who is the, you know, I was reading something on UPI.
So who has more market share in UPI transactions?
Yeah.
Is it PhonePe or JustPay?
What I read recently was PhonePe.
No. It's ironically, see, this is why I asked the question. So thank you for giving me an opportunity.
I failed
to
now,
push
right?
it.
So
Yes.
I got
and
it.
now I'm
I
going to go
failed.
to Sanjay in a minute. But I think we have this enormous bias in India to only look at seen startups. PhonePe is a startup whose products you can see. JustPay's products you can't see because they're a B2B player. But Sanjay, I think you track UPI also very closely. I would imagine that JustPay powers a larger proportion of UPI transactions even today than PhonePe does at this point in time. Is that true? And what would be your opinion on Naganand's
I read the data in the paper yesterday where
trying to
PhonePe
bribe
was
you.
put at the top. So that's why
Don't
I
get
said that I
bribed.
gave the answer.
So you are actually, I don't think I know the exact percentage of JustPay's transactions, but it's pretty high. JustPay powers a lot of the banks interface to NPCI and UPI. They also were the people who helped create Bheem. And so there's a lot of things that they have done which have effectively created the benchmark to which a lot of the UPI ecosystem strives to. So from that perspective, I think to the success of UPI, I would say JustPay was a very critical player in making that happen. The part about VC investing, I actually disagree with you, Sharad. VC is a pure monetary beast. They're driven by one thing and one thing only, which is profit. And there's a lot more profit in the B2C space than the B2B space. Though B2B companies can be very valuable and profitable in terms of net, if you take a look at the top line, and risk, by the way. There's more risk in the B2C space as well. So the risk-reward ratio favors that as a VC investment.
So before I come to you, Rajiv, you know, one of our challenges in the country is that we don't appreciate the hidden platforms that power the ecosystem. And in some sense, DPI, by its very definition, is infrastructure. It's hidden behind a service or an experience that somebody else will offer. Either a government will offer to its citizens, an NGO will offer to its beneficiaries, or a startup like PhonePe will offer to its customers. So we underplay the importance of this. And yet, at this point in time, the world is beginning to turn towards India to understand this story better. Now, you have dealt with this world before because you were part of Invest India, where you were pitching to them a view of India, you know, which would attract them to come to India. Now, this is Act 2 of the same story in some way. Tell us what is different about this, what's more exciting, what's more difficult. You know, share your thoughts a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me here. So, I would say that, you know, things mature, and DPI, the India stack, is at a level of maturity in the country where it is at a stage where it can take off globally. So the last year, India was the president chairing the presidency of the G20, and during the G20 deliberations, the year-long deliberations, at the end of that, there was a Delhi declaration brought out, which said that they would endeavor to take DPI initiatives globally. There was a definition of DPI which basically focuses on it being an open source platform, open content, open data, an element of interoperability, and an element of, societal goods. It should serve societal goods and should have a certain amount of regulatory guardrails. Now, we in NISG stands for National Institute of Smart Government. We are a not-for-profit, semi-government company which has been working with the government. We are an IT consulting company which has been working to roll out e-government initiatives for the government of India. And now that the India stack has matured, it's reached a level of maturity, there is a huge opportunity to take this experience globally. And this is something that we are engaged in. And key players from the government side in this is the Ministry of External Affairs and the Ministry of Electronics and IT. And on the private side, there are, of course, private companies, there are product providers, there are companies like the MOSIP, the Modular Open Source Integrated Platform, which is funded partly by the Gates Foundation, provides an open source for building a foundational ID. There are players, Indian companies who are in this business. Many of them are Bangalore and Hyderabad based. There are international companies, very big companies like IDEMIA and Thales, who are involved in this business. And together, we are in a process of taking some of these DPI initiatives globally. To put it into kind of more perspective and bring out some cases on which we are working, there is a huge, a nationwide foundational ID project which is being undertaken by Sri Lanka, a fairly large country. They tried it once, didn't succeed, and now we are a project management consultant for them, and we will in the coming months see an RFP for rolling out this foundational ID project in Sri Lanka. Similarly, in the global south, n number of countries, we are working with Gambia, we are working with Mauritius, we are working with Myanmar. There are opportunities in Belize. There's a delegation from Fiji which is coming over in January to see what India is doing. Hopefully that will lead to some initiative. There are a couple of pilot projects which are happening in several countries. A South African delegation is coming up next week, in the first week of December. They'll be coming to Bangalore also. And they want to see what has happened in India, what they can emulate. Maybe they can start off with a pilot project. And it's not only limited to foundational ID programs, although most countries globally want to start off with the foundational ID program similar to our Aadhaar, because the benefits from a government point of view, from a governance point of view, as well as from a citizen point of view, are they're kind of low-hanging fruits which the government as well as the citizens can benefit out of a foundational ID program. But then there are several other initiatives like what the UPI, which was just now talked of, the PhonePe, the JustPays, in the education field, in the health field, in let's say an example like a product like a DigiLocker. So there's a lot of interest globally in all these programs. We as a consulting company, as a not-for-profit company, try and bridge the gap between the government, the financiers, could be a Gates Foundation, could be certain other bodies. There's a lot of CSR funding also available for this. And we try to create, we familiarize these countries facilitate their delegations to visit India, visit the experience centers, see on ground what has happened in India, and then help them create a project report and even handhold them to undertake a pilot project. That's the role that we play. And for those of you in the audience who would like to kind of work with us on this, we'd be more than happy to connect post this session. There are a lot of opportunities globally which are available, particularly in the global south. In the Delhi Declaration, a commitment was also made by the Government of India that there would be a social impact fund created, and Indian government would provide $25 million towards that fund as Indian contribution. That fund is in the making, and I think by another month or so, that should also see the light of the day. Let me stop at that point, and I'll be happy to answer some more queries.
Thank you, Rajiv ji. So we'll go a little deeper. Sanjay, I want to come back to you. You know, there are, as this concept becomes more accepted across the world, there is also a kind of a definition creep that is stepping in. And I want you to talk a little bit about that. First definition creep that seems to be coming in, that all government tech is DPI, right? And that is obviously not true. And I'd like you to explain why that is not true. Second is that all open source is DPI, or all DPI has to be open source. They are complementary concepts, but they are not synonyms of each other. Could you spend a few minutes explaining our audience about the relationship of DPI with government tech and the relationship of DPI with open source, to contrast DPI from those concepts, to explain that all open source is not DPI and all government tech is not DPI? Your thoughts.
Sure.
And Rajiv ji, maybe you can add to that after that, if you like.
Yeah, so Sharad, this is a very live discussion. I have seen in the last 6 months about 4 or 5 different definitions of DPI. And they all vary subtly from each other, but they're not the same. And getting a large, and what has happened is that I think the success that we have seen in India has excited a lot of conversation globally, because we are able to improve on many parameters because of what happened in India, the tech revolution, so to speak. And that then has sparked this massive conversation. DPI was referenced in the Delhi Declaration by India, and then later it's made its way into the more recent G20 declaration that came out earlier this week from Brazil. And in between that, there was a Global Development Compact at the UN, where again DPI was referenced as a way to get to the Sustainable Development Goals. And so, you know, this has now become really a big global conversation. And so now, so I want to sort of step back and say, where do I think, what is DPI and so on? And, you know, everybody will have their own choices for different reasons. So the first part about DPI that I think about is infrastructure, which is that it is something on which other people can build and, you know, get solutions to users. So the I part of it is a definitional element. Not necessarily the most important, but it is a definitional element certainly. So if you're building tech which is not allowing other folks to build on top of it, it might be by the government, it might be by the private sector, then that would not be, in my view, DPI. So if, for instance, let's just take UPI. If NPCI had built a front-end app and not allowed an ecosystem to develop around it, and even if it had been very successful, it would still not be in that classification. The second part of it, which comes back to, is the word public. And again, there's a lot of conversation on what does public mean in DPI. And where we are settling towards, and it's not final, is that the public means it's something that's built and managed for public benefit and not necessarily public ownership. So you could have a system which is privately owned, run privately, but managed for public benefit, which could be a DPI. And vice versa, there could be a government system which is not managed in the same way would also not be then DPI, right? So that's where we are trending towards. I mean, digital is, I think, very little confusion about digital, but on these two terms, this is where we are landing. Now, where does open source fit into this? Open source fits into this because, in a sense, I think there's a very strong ideological alignment between open source and the DPI movement.
Between classical open source versus corporate open source. That distinction is important to make, right?
Right. So but that alignment exists where the idea is that you build it in the open, people can see what is there, so the public benefit can be sort of guaranteed because there are public eyes looking at the code to understand what is there. But it's not a requirement. It is certainly because alignment is there. And open source also managed to get into the digital public goods definition, which is where some of this confusion of open source comes in, because DPG's definition includes open source. So that's broadly, I would say, where we are landing, is that this is close alignment, but they're not the same on both fronts, on open source and public ownership.
So Rajiv ji, you mentioned 7 areas that you're working on. In some respects, the thought process that is emerging is that there are many asanas in DPI. DPI is like yoga.
Okay.
Yoga has 84 asanas. How many of you practice yoga? All right, so keep your hands up. Do you also practice Yoga Sutra? Okay, so I see some hands going up and some hands coming down. See, yoga has 2 parts. It has Yoga Asana and Yoga Sutra. And very often the Western version of yoga has only become Yoga Asana, right? There is no emphasis on Yoga Sutra. Actually, the utility of yoga is when you practice both, right? And I see one member in our audience, she is violently agreeing with us. So this is, by the way, also true for DPI. DPI has these manifestations, which are the 7 asanas that you are focusing on, out of many more that exist. But really, the reality, the benefits of DPI accrue then when you actually think of the right principles that underpin them as well. And those are called DPI Sutras. And since in April, India took upon itself the responsibility of launching these DPI Sutras at the UN, and now is promoting them very actively, because for the world to benefit, we don't want this replication of only asana going out without the principles. Rajiv ji, given your experience of dealing with the world outside, right, and the tendency to reduce it to its simplified and oversimplified form, what is it that we can do so that we don't allow DPI to just become DPI Asana, but also focus on DPI Sutras? Any thought about that? And this definitional issue is an element related to that, but there are other aspects of this that are covered in the DPI Sutras as well.
Thank you. On the definitional issue, at a personal level, I'm really amazed at the amount of discussion that happens at global platforms on this definition. And I'm also amazed at the variations and the differences of opinions or the differences of viewpoints that emerge at these global platforms. To my mind, a concept which can be fairly, simply defined, what is DPI. I would say that the Delhi Declaration definition is something which brings together all the varying thoughts and viewpoints, and by and large, we've stuck to that definition. I have a paper which kind of lists out that Delhi Declaration, but it's all available on internet, so I don't plan to read it. There is politics also globally on this as to what should be included in DPI and what shouldn't be included. And different countries, different powerful nations have different interests because they are at varying stages of the maturity cycle. The industry back home is at varying stages of maturity. But let us say the point that Sanjay ji was mentioning, let us say there is towers, communication towers. Now, communication towers could be owned by a telecom company or by a third party for a telecom company, but they're not available for use for everybody, you know, in an open manner. So technically that would not be DPI. That would be an infrastructure which is owned by a company, which could be a telecom company, or that a company could be providing those services to a B company, which is a telecom company, but that would not be a DPI. Let us say an undersea cable, which is connecting continents, which is owned, which could be an independent entity or owned by several telecom companies globally, but it's not available for societal use on a free basis, or even on payment, it's not even available to everybody equitably, is not a DPI, I would say. So perhaps looking at what is not DPI helps us to get clarity on what is the essential elements of DPI. But on the principles bit that Sharadji asked at the second point, our experience is that, you know, India is a large country. We have a very big global presence now. And there is a huge amount of awareness in the global south, and not only in global south, but in the global north also, about what is happening in India. And we have seen, if I talk about global south, countries, many of these countries have got departments of digital economy. They have set up departments, ministries, divisions for digital economy. But they're not very clear on how do we go ahead. Broadly, I would say the foundational ID program seems to be the most interest to them. But they're not very clear how do we go ahead with it. So they want to develop a system, a pilot project, we're doing a pilot project for a country, and they say, can you do this for us and just roll out 5,000 IDs, that's all, just 5,000, so that they get a feel and hang of it that this is doable. One of the big things in this from a citizen point of view is the whole issue of privacy. How will the privacy get safeguarded? And there is so much talk about, you know, in India we said data is the new oil, and will this data be taken over by international companies, multinational companies, will be utilized for commercial purposes? So there is a lot of apprehension and bordering on skepticism on this aspect. I was earlier in the Civil Aviation Ministry, and we developed DigiYatra. And many of you would have used the DigiYatra at the airports. There is so much apprehension on
Rajiv, if I can add some fun here, before the audience asks us a question, can I ask them a question which includes DigiYatra?
Sure, please.
Are you open for a question? Here is what I'm going to pose to you, right? There are actually 3 questions you have to answer yes and no. Let us say you came from another city to Bangalore this morning. You took a flight. You took a flight in Mumbai, entered the airport using DigiYatra. You were hungry, so you had a snack at the airport and paid for it using UPI. Fair enough? And then you landed here in Bangalore, and then you took a Ola or a Uber and paid for it again using UPI. So this is the scenario. You have 2 back-to-back transactions on UPI, one in Mumbai, one in Bangalore. And before that UPI transaction, you use DigiYatra. I'm going to ask you 3 questions, and you have to give me a yes and no answer. First question, can the government go to DigiYatra Foundation and say all the flights that you have taken in the last 6 months, iske details de do hame. Give me all the details of all the flights that this person has taken in the last 6 months. Yes or no? How many of you feel the answer to that is yes? Raise your hand. All right. Second is, do you think NPCI, who got to see your 2 UPI transactions, knows that you were in Bombay earlier and now you are in Bangalore, because they know one transaction was in Mumbai and one transaction is in Bangalore? How many of you think NPCI has that information about you because you use UPI in that way? How many of you think the answer to that is yes? I have some very enthusiastic youngsters voting yes. Anybody else who thinks, just to check, because I don't know how many of you are sitting this out, how many of you think this is no? All right. The third is, remember this UPI debited your bank account. It is quite likely not only this bank account, but other bank accounts you may have opened using Aadhaar KYC. So is there a dashboard in the Government of India, or can there be a dashboard in the Government of India or RBI which puts in your Aadhaar number and out pops all the 3 bank accounts that you had done Aadhaar KYC with? How many of you think such a dashboard can exist or already exists in the Government of India? Now, the correct answer to all these 3 questions is no, no, and no. And this is why India's story is succeeding outside. And I want to tell you about this. The first no is because DigiYatra, that technical capability does not exist. All that information is in your phone, which is removed in the wallet of your phone by the app that you have. It is not maintained. There is no central store of this. So even if the Government of India comes and asks, they can't get an answer.
It's purged. They use the word, it's purged within hours of the flight.
It is purged. When you accept it, it says it will be purged in 24 hours. But right now, it is being purged in 3 hours, actually, as we speak. So in 3 hours, it's purged. If the Government of India comes after that, they can't even get it because it doesn't exist. UPI protocol is designed in such a way, and some of that credit goes to Sanjay, who's one of the designers of that protocol, is that this protocol does not have the provision for sharing the location code with NPCI. So NPCI knows you did 2 transactions, but it does not know one was in Bombay and one was in Bangalore. The third, Aadhaar KYC, is again designed in such a way that there is no Aadhaar number stored by the bank. In fact, it is illegal to store that number, and there's no provision for storing that number. All that you get when you do Aadhaar KYC is a virtual code. So, and the UIDAI doesn't know that. They don't know who was the authenticating agency or an entity at that point in time. So these are the sutras that we are talking about. These are the deep thoughts that are actually making the Indian DPI story attractive as much in a very privacy-concerned country like Germany or in Global South that we are talking about, because the issues are the same. Now, what I want to also bring out here is that yes, our identity is attractive to, so this is a question to both of you, and I will round up with a question to both of you a little later, is that it is true that Global North wants a little bit of our India stack, which is to do with data. Middle-income countries like Vietnam want essentially open networks, and low-income countries want identity to start with. Is that an oversimplification, or Rajiv ji, is that a fair way to describe the interest that we are seeing from rest of the world?
I think that's pretty fair. Lower income countries want to start off with the foundational ID, which is the correct thing also to my mind, because the benefits from that program are the most visible, and from a government point of view, they want to, like our Jan Dhan Yojana, they want to move money directly into the beneficiary's account. So that's the easiest to do. What we started off also with direct benefit transfer way back in 2013. And from a citizen point of view, he or she wants to get the entire subsidy or the support that the government gives in entirety into his bank account, and that also with no time lag. It should be instantaneous. So this is the best way forward. But over the last 1 year, we are seeing interest from the global north. I mean, and I don't want to name countries here, but from countries in Europe who want to look at certain elements of the India stack. And there they are not looking at foundational ID. They have a strong ID system, whether it is a social security system in the US or any other system in citizenship system in Europe. but they're looking at certain other elements. And that is where there's a lot of scope also for innovation as well as competition.
So some people start yoga because of back pain, some start for other reasons. So there are different asanas are the different starting points. Yet Sanjay, is that your experience as well, that there's a different starting point for different countries in this journey on DPI?
Yeah, I think there are different starting points. And part of it is that countries want the most important thing that they don't have. And till recently, World Bank used to publish this, I mean, they still publish the data, called Findex, which used to count financial inclusion, but also started to count people who don't have an ID. And there was a number about earlier in last decade where we had over 1.5 billion or 2 billion people without an ID. And because of what happened in India, that number dropped by half. And so today we still have about 850 million people in the world who don't have a good ID. And that's something which the World Bank tracks, and I think that's all of those countries are looking at saying, not all, some are not, but most are looking at that thing and saying, how do we get to know who's our citizen, who's not, and how do we make sure we can serve them right? And so what is the most cost-effective way to get there? That's India's.
So Naganand, I want to come back to the question that I teed up a little earlier, which was that, look, these are very large numbers, not just in India, but across the world. And these range from global north to middle-income countries to global south, right? All low-income countries. This DPI revolution is going to touch all of them, as you are hearing. What will it take for early movers like you in the VC industry who see this opportunity to convert the remaining crowd to become big participants in this DPI concept from India, animating the rest of the world? What's holding it back? Why is it that your colleagues and other VCs are happy to bring concepts from the West, usually America, into India, but are reluctant to take concepts from India to the rest of the world? And what do you think we should do to change their mind and get them active participants in this as we go forward?
So I think, Sharad, if you look at the DPI infrastructure and the application space, because we are not going down further in the protocol stack, there are 4 things that I look at, right? There is a identity, there is a data layer, and there is a transaction, and there is an infrastructure, right? So that is broadly what I see as the 4 building blocks for anything to move forward. And different countries are in different stages in all of these areas, right? The question is, if you want this to be taken from a private perspective, not from a government to government, but from a private perspective, what are you disrupting in what layer, and how are you monetizing it? Short term, mid term, long term? That's a different question to answer, right? I think, for example, in the financial space, now India is showing capability in the OCEN, in terms of the data security. We have DEPA, we have a whole bunch of things. I think slowly we are showing to the world and in India that, things can be innovated on top of what is existing, right? Because a lot of things in India are being provided by the infrastructure. NPCI is doing something, OCEN is doing something. So the government is moderating well, but in many places, government may or may not want to moderate. So that is a policy level question, because some are determined by the policy, some are determined by what the government can provide, some are determined by what...
You are giving excuses rather than giving answers.
No. So because we, in India, I'm saying, even in India, if you look at it, we are slowly pushing it, right?
Don't you think he's not giving us a fair answer? He instead of being harsh on his VC colleagues and say they should make these 3 changes, he is kind of being litigant on their behalf and saying this is why they don't do it. No, that's not the answer we want.
I'm going to the same question, right? So in the model-wise, as a VC, so path to monetization and where can you innovate are the 2 fundamental things. Though some things can be done very easily from the government side, something you have to innovate, because to Sanjay's point, unless until you see a clear path to monetization and quantum of monetization, VCs will not invest, right? That mentality is not going to change because the market is driven by that. But now we have shown that there are a few companies that have done that, like PhonePe and other guys, JustPay have done that. So I think that model has to be replicated, both within India and outside India. And it's a question of us getting educated ourselves first and feeling comfortable with that.
So the last question goes to you.
Actually want to answer that.
Yeah, why don't you comment on that and then
Yes.
I'll pose the last question.
Yes. So I think it's a question that should not stay with the VCs. It's also a question of political will, right? The Western world, which has benefited from large tech going global and bringing a lot of wealth into their country, has not been sufficiently incentivized to spark large-scale innovation, enabling DPIs, right, the way the India model has played out. But I think there's soon going to be a forcing function just coming out of demographics. In this whole means of production of land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, land and labor is disappearing, right? Land has become, of course, least important over the years, but with large-scale automation, with change in demographics becoming older, right? Most countries have become more old than young, far more people living on retirement benefits than being productive in the workforce. You cannot escape a forcing function of welfare being universal. I should not even use the word welfare, right? You just need universal basic income, universal health coverage. And that is best done when you have the layers of identity, payments, and data sorted. Right.
So the flow of people, money, and information is probably becoming as important as land, labor, capital. And I agree.
So even countries that have been uber capitalistic.
But look, in India, we have to a large extent solved the flow of people, money, and capital. I want to end on this note. You know, a discussion that we were having in the speakers hall a little earlier about paranoia. You know, because this India concept is doing well, I think there is a little bit of we have arrived mindset that is appearing in India. While the reality is that the hard work that we need to do to build on this flow of people, money, and capital, for example, to have a health system that will deliver good health at $200 per capita instead of $600 that Thailand is able to use, is not a finished revolution by any chance. So that revolution remains. That requires the private sector, that requires policy making, that requires new way of thinking about DPI. How paranoid should we be to make sure that this unfinished revolution, we don't give it up? Because sometimes as a country, we have a tendency to declare victory too early. Are you worried about that? And if you are, what should we do to prevent that outcome from happening?
Yeah, so the...
Yeah, sure.
I mean, actually, why don't you go?
And she can end on her thoughts.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that, we built this system in India and it's going global. I think we also have to recognize that we now also have to take the ideas coming the other way. So when we take this, from my current position where I am now looking at it on a global basis, there are innovations in other places also in the way governments function, the way public systems work, and some of which we should consider bringing back to India as well and us learning from them. I think we are educating the world, and the classic thing when you're educating people, the world is it educates you. And we have to be humble enough to recognize that and see what is it that we can bring back. So this idea that we have arrived, so we are sitting on a pedestal and everybody else is not, I think is one which we should challenge.
And especially because we have unfinished things to do, right? And we need world's best ideas to finish that, and it's critical for us that we do that. What do you feel, Sudha? This is the closing thought, and we'll end up.
In interest of time, I would say fiercely protect 2 of the 5 sutras. The first of citizen privacy and agency. You cannot compromise on that. And I think the 4th one, which is inclusion, in a world that is becoming very unequal, if you protect the inclusion agenda of DPIs, let that be fierce and let that be with paranoia.
Yeah, and I would probably end by saying I think we should give ourselves fairly good marks, 12 years in, on financial inclusion, although that alone is an unfinished revolution. That will become a finished revolution when Rajni gets that intraday loan on a cash flow basis. We are still 2-3 years away from that. Second is health. We have only scratched the surface. Much remains. In fact, 95% of work remains to be done. And I think a pedagogy change in education, which is now a kind of a crisis facing us, right? Given that we have the largest number of children in the world, is something that we have to bring to life, and if we don't, we will have a lost generation and a lost country. So I think we must remain focused, we must remain paranoid on the work that remains to be done. while we celebrate the work that has already been done. On that note, we'll bring this to an end. Thank you for being an excellent audience.
Thank you very much for that wonderful session. I would now request the moderator, Mr. Sharad Sharma, to give a mementos to all the panelists. I would request Mr. Sanjay Jain to kindly accept the memento first. Thank you, Mr. Sanjay Jain. Mr. Rajiv Bansal. To Madam Sudha Srinivasan. To Mr. Naganand Doreswamy. And finally, I would request Mr. Naganand Doreswamy to give a memento to our moderator. So, digital public infrastructure of India going global. With this, we come to the end of this particular session. We have one more session to go before we head for lunch. So, we'll set up the stage in the next 2 to 3 minutes. I would request all of you to kindly stay back. Startups